And I'm very interested in trying to understand, all through my life really, the difference between good history and not such good history. I mean, good history is history which tries to emphasize how different certain periods were, how different the psychology was. There's always a great tendency, I think, in our modern era to, particularly, if I may say, in the media, and Dan Snow is a very honourable exception to this, but to make history, as it were, relevant to today by drawing parallels which aren't really there. And so discussions of the ancient world have to be made to look like the Cold War, as if somehow they don't have enough relevance in their own sense. And those who make history programs and military history programs which don't fall into that trap, I think are extraordinarily welcome, Dan, and are relatively few and far between. And when it comes to entertainment, history entertainment, most of the popular history dramas that we have are not much more than Hollyoaks in tights. You wonder really why they've bothered to make it historical. It's teenage kids' entertainment, and fine, it's no worse for that. But it doesn't have any sense, there's no attempt to create this image of what history really should be. Because ultimately, history is about a different era. They do things differently there in the past. And so I think a good historian also has to use an active imagination. It's not all analysis, it's analysis and imagination. And that imagination is about people. It's about the human condition in different times, in different cultures, in different circumstances. And there's a great deal that we can learn, not just from analytical literature, of course, but also from fiction. And I've always thought that the best historians are also voracious readers of fiction and historical fiction. And there are certain things in both analytical writing and in fiction which, for any reader, they just reach out and they grab you. And certain things just really pull you in. And the sort of things that have pulled me in have been, if I think about what motivates people, the sort of things that have pulled me in both in fiction and in analytical literature have been some of the aspects of human behavior. I mean, one of the most obvious ones is courage. Courage, it is said, a man's courage is his capital, and he's always spending it, so the saying goes, and that applies to women as well, of course. And the fact is, nobody gets more courageous the more battles they fight. They get less courageous, if anything. Courage is something that one starts with, and with every operation, every scare, every battle, it gets used up. You're always spending it, you're never adding to it. And by and large, people in successive operations, successive battles, they certainly get better at it. They get more experience, they get better at taking care of themselves, taking care of their mates, they get better at being streetwise. But by and large, they don't become more courageous. And some of the greatest acts of courage are usually at the beginning of a battle or the beginning of a campaign in situations of enormous desperation. And it's been observed both individually and collectively among armies and corps and brigades, that when an operation or a war is coming towards an end, when the battle is beginning to wind down, then people are not very courageous. Why should they be? Who wants to get killed like Wilfred Owen 2 days before the finish, or whatever it might be? And I think that literature has a great deal to tell us about this. Len Dayton, very good thriller writer, wrote 2 excellent books in the 1970s, one called Fighter and one called Bomber. About the bomber offensive. Fighter was about the Battle of Britain. And using his skill as an author, he produced some wonderful passages which were analytical but had that active imagination. And it is a fact that in the Battle of Britain, British pilots, they lacked nothing in, or RAF pilots I should say, they were from many, many countries, but they lacked nothing in courage, but their airmanship and their gunnery wasn't that good. And they were up against a much more experienced adversary. And as Len Dayton said in one of his passages, he said that a lot of young fighter pilots, they were going into battle climbing, they were still climbing. Usually they were climbing into the sun. Almost always they were outnumbered. And their gunnery and their airmanship wasn't that good. And he says, he has a passage in there that says something like, a lot of young men met their deaths that way, breathing heavily into their oxygen mask, covered in sweat, blinded by the sun, their aircraft slipping sideways in the thin air because their airmanship wasn't really good enough to control it without thinking. And most of them didn't even know what killed them. It was a rake of bullets along the fuselage into the cockpit, or it was a big clunk behind them, and then suddenly the controls would just go haywire and the aircraft would take on a mind of its own. Or worst of all, a metallic sort of thwack in front of them in the engine block. And then some flames would start to come into the cockpit with a 300-mile slipstream behind it. That was the worst of all, of course. And most of these men didn't know anything about it. But they went again and again. They still went, even though they were inexperienced but they showed a sort of raw courage at the beginning of a battle. Max Hastings, in his book on the Far Eastern War, something that really reached out and grabbed me is he talked about the circumstances of death on the Burma Railway. And he said so many of these young soldiers, captives, POWs, died on the Burma Railway, as we know. And he says, interestingly, he said it wasn't the worst sort of death one might have in a war, actually. Most of these men, if they were going to die in the war, if they were destined to die in the war, most of them died with their head propped up on the haversack, surrounded by their mates, somebody holding their hand, somebody talking to them as they drifted away. It wasn't the worst sort of death, it wasn't the one we choose for ourselves, but there was a sort of a dignity in that. And it was one of those moments in reading it that really takes me. And while we're thinking about the Far Eastern War, George MacDonald Fraser, great novelist, the Flashman novels, great writer. And he wrote a wonderful memoir of his time with the Cumbrian regiments, Cumberland, quartered safe out here, of his time in Burma. And George MacDonald Fraser, of course, by the time he's writing it, he'd become a bit of a crusty old man. And he disapproved of so much in British society by the time he wrote that. But he was such a wonderful writer. And he talks about heroism. He has a long passage. He says, heroism these days, sporting heroes, anyone in uniform is a hero, anyone at the scene of an accident is a hero. Heroism is a word that's much misused. And he said, I remember a lad, Stanley Clarke. He said he was a big, tall drink of water, 6'4", young lad, 19. He was mild-mannered. He seemed sort of wet, but he was there. And at one point that MacDonald Fraser describes, he said that the Japanese attacked when they were out from the perimeter of their base, and there was a really nasty firefight in the jungle, really nasty hand-to-hand stuff, and they all got back into the perimeter. And Stanley Clarke looked around, found that his mate wasn't there, so he went back out. And he went out about 100 yards, and he found his mate lying there. He'd been bayoneted 4 or 5 times, he was dying. And he says, Stanley Clarke, he sat there with his mate while he died, and he put himself in enormous danger. The place was still full of Japanese running around trying to find ways into the perimeter to attack. And he said, and when I see heroes used, I think of Stanley Clarke, young lad, 19, 6'3", drink of water, who sat with his friend so that his friend wouldn't go through death, that lonely passage entirely on his own. And he said, and that's real heroism, that's real courage. So one is taken by not just stirring stories, but very human stories. And if you think about courage, we also think about leadership, another very, very human quality. I think one of the greatest phrases of the 21st century, the best leadership phrase I ever heard in the 21st century, and it's never been repeated very much, was by Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York. And what he seemed to do after 9/11, he did what leaders should do. He found a form of words which mobilizes the innate emotions of people. Leadership is not just about setting out the parameters, setting out the details, the technicalities. Leadership is emotional as much as anything else. We all know that. And good leaders are able to put into words what other people want to think or only half think. It motivates and moves their emotions. And Blomberg, on the day after 9/11, he made a speech about what this did to our city, New York, and he finished it by saying the last 2 lines of every verse of our national anthem is that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. So tomorrow, go to work and be brave. Brilliant, brilliant. He just encapsulated in a few words the need to respect their national characteristics. Tomorrow, go to work and be brave. Absolutely brilliant. And of course, we think of ourselves, we think in the United Kingdom, great leadership is, you don't go far away from Churchill when you think about leadership. Not a very successful politician at other times in his life, but a very successful politician, certainly from 1940 to 1944. And he had a vision of leadership which is very sentimental, but it was what was required certainly in 1940. He used to talk about our island story. Not very good history, that, actually. But it was good leadership. Our island story. He used to say, if our island story is now to come to an end, then so be it. But let it not end before we are lying on the pavement, covered in our own blood in an effort to defend it. All that sort of thing. But one of his great phrases was their finest hour, 1940, their finest hour. And it's used to justify the things that Len Dayton was talking about, the Battle of Britain. It's used as the phrase which expresses the fight of the Battle of Britain. But actually, that speech in which he used that phrase, their finest hour, was made on the 18th of June, the day that France surrendered, way before the Battle of Britain effectively began. And the reason he used it that day, and I find this really interesting, this speech, it was the day on which Britain stood alone. It was the day on which we were totally isolated. And remember that the German army had been totally successful until then. In 1936, the occupation of the Rhineland, 1937, the Anschluss with Austria. 1938, the move into the Sudetenland. Then March 39, the occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then 1940, the blitzkrieg into Poland, and then the occupation of Denmark and Norway, and then the Benelux countries, and then France, the blitzkrieg there. These guys had not only never been beaten, they'd never even been slowed down. And now Britain was next. And so in the 18th of June, that was a pretty dark day. The Evening Standard headline for the 18th of June, the headline that they had out on the streets there was, France makes peace, now we're in the final. Sort of jaunty sort of headline. But he couldn't afford to be jaunty, and he made his speech to the House of Commons. And his speeches didn't go down very well in the Commons because he was a dangerous politician, lots of opposition. And a lot of his speeches were regarded as just sort of windy rhetoric. But of course, Churchill, I think, was the first British politician to really understand the power of the media. And he would make his speech in the House of Commons, and then a recorded version of the speech would then be played that night to the nation. And in that speech on the 18th of June, he did a very curious thing for a politician, because he wanted to describe the situation as it existed. He said that France has fallen. He said the Battle of France is over. The battle for Britain, he called it, the battle for Britain must soon begin. And on the outcome of this battle depends the fate of civilization. Very clear, this wasn't just about Britain, this was about civilization. That was what he thought, that was what he said was at stake. But for a politician, he then did something very strange. Mostly politicians will end on an up note. They'll end on an upswing. But he didn't. He did the opposite. The upswing came before the end. He said, if we prevail in this coming battle, then the world can move on to the bright sunlit uplands, as he called them, of peace and progress. And then he said, but if we fail, then first Europe, and eventually the rest of the world will fall into a new dark age, made more terrible by perverted science. Very perceptive, a new dark age, made more terrible by perverted science. So he finished on the downer in order to set up this last sentence, the words. So then, let us brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Now, those are brilliant words, and they're worth deconstructing a little bit, because this is leadership in action. This is literature. This is the space between words, because I contend that those last little phrases, that's pure Shakespeare. I could bore you all night long as to where he got that from. I mean, the nuances, the rhythms, even quite a lot of the words. It's straight Shakespeare. So let us brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves. Again, he didn't say, let us strive to meet our service delivery targets. None of that rubbish. I mean, it was all personal. It was people. Brace yourself to your duty. So bear ourselves. That if the British Commonwealth and its empire lasts for 1,000 years, he didn't say last for a long time, or last forever, which are meaningless. 1,000 years, a big number, a number that you could grasp. And Hitler, of course, had talked about the 1,000-year Reich. So he said, right, well, if the British Empire lasts for 1,000 years, men will still say, not it will be said, but men will still say, people in 1,000 years' time will still say, if people living now, men will still say, and then a pause, this was their finest hour. He didn't say, men will still say that this was their finest hour. He pauses, because when you use those last four words, you are imitating the words that men in 1,000 years' time will use of men living now. It was brilliant stuff, and it is almost pure iambic pentameter. It's Shakespeare. And I don't think he thought about that. I don't think he analysed it. He felt it, because he was very well read, he understood literature, and he had that sense of rhythm. It's the words and the meaning and the space between the words that really matter. And if we think about courage and we think about leadership, we should also, when we're thinking about people, also think about battle and the effects of battle, particularly the effects after battle. It is a statistical fact that the final phases of most battles see the greatest casualties, usually for the victorious side. And that applies from the Battle of Marathon right through to the Battle of Waterloo. When the set-piece battle breaks, then it's the chaos of the last phase of the battle, which is most dangerous, usually from what we would now call blue-on-blue, friendly fire incidents, misidentification, and sheer chaos. People get run down by horses, they get run down by vehicles. The end of battle casualties are some of the most regrettable, but in fact they are statistically quite prevalent. And post-battle psychology is also a very interesting issue. Everybody reacts differently. I mean, some people sit down and cry for their mothers. Others engage in acts of casual cruelty. Most are very morose. But everybody feels something. And above all, there is battle exhaustion. after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Wellington's forces found themselves down on the plain and then up on the French side. And they, once they received no further orders and there were no further enemies in front of them, they just stopped. I mean, the Prussians had taken up the pursuit, they stopped. And in that area, the Battle of Waterloo that Wellington fought was about 1.5 miles square, as it were, sort of an elongated square. And in that area of about 1.5 miles, that morning, it had stood shoulder high in a corn, waiting to be harvested. And less than 12 hours later, that was all trodden down, and there were 42,000 men and over 10,000 horses lying dead in that space. And in that space, the British Army, Wellington's army, just fell asleep, fell down and fell asleep. Sheer battle weariness. It's the sheer nervous energy. And Wellington did the same. When he'd met Blucher at La Belle Alliance, he went back to his quarters in Waterloo. He had dinner, very quiet dinner. Only one of his staff was left. All the others had been killed or injured. Had a very quiet dinner, and then he went and he lay down. And like his men in the field, fully clothed, filthy and stinking from the battle, he lay down and fell asleep. Sheer nervous energy. Woke up about 3 hours later, as did his men. And that's been observed as well in the First World War. I mean, men coming out of the line after 36 hours, 48 hours of an engagement, they'd come out like zombies. And they'd come out as all these tracks in and out of the trenches were basically single file. The men who were going in to relieve them would line up. They'd be on the side. And as the lads came out who'd been fighting, the relieving force, they'd cheer them and shout things to them. And they used to record in many of their diaries, these guys, they just couldn't see anything. They were like zombies when they came out. And they'd get back to the holding area, and somebody could just push them gently on the chest, and they'd fall over, wouldn't be able to get up again, they'd be asleep within 4 or 5 seconds. Sheer nervous exhaustion. That's the way it affects people. But it affects people in a longer way as well. Battle and operations are a bit like radiation. You can take in so much, but it never leaves you. The Americans have been doing, since the Second World War, have done quite a lot of research on this, and it seems to be fairly robust, that the number of days the average person, male or female, can spend on the front line, that is, in a situation where they are in danger, either involved in combat or where combat is part of their daily routine or preparation for combat. The number of days they can spend on average, of course, is a very big phrase. It covers a multitude of variations. But on average is 150 days in a lifetime, after which most people will start to show some real battlefield stress. And, of course, we know that in Afghanistan, a lot of our boys and girls have done that way into their second tour. And it's a real issue, because a small proportion of our people these days give up their lives when they go on operations. A slightly larger proportion give up normality for the rest of their lives with life-changing injuries. But all of them give up a little portion of their sanity when they go on these operations. And I think that's something to be thought about, and it requires an act of our imagination to get through what that feels like. And there are people in this room who know what that feels like. But even then, it's quite hard for people who've done it to explain it. With the best will in the world, with the best articulation in the world, there's an inner problem, an inner truth, an inner dynamic, which even those who are witness to it directly can't always be true to. And so we come back to art and literature. Steve McQueen, the artist, not the movie star, Steve McQueen, the artist, produced an exhibition which we ran at Russia a couple of years ago called Queen and Country, which was the image of the 179 casualties, British casualties, in the Iraq War. And they were presented as postage stamps. So every one of the 179 faces, with the permission of their parents or their next of kin, was presented. And there was a campaign to make them into postage stamps as an act of different sort of remembrance. It was very clever artwork. The post office didn't agree. They wouldn't allow these things to become stamps. There was a campaign about it. And one of the arguments against it was they said, well, stamps are treated very badly. When the letter arrives, people then tear up the envelope, they toss it on the fire, they use it to write shopping lists, they put it in their back pocket. Of course they do. So in a sense, they're dishonouring the image. But next day, another image turns up, and the day after, and the day after that, and the day after that. It's a form of remembrance that won't go away. However many shopping lists we write, however many fires we light. The cleverness of that idea was that this is remembrance that comes to us on a daily basis. It was a very clever piece of art, Steve McQueen. Alas, it didn't become a real piece of post office policy. And so I think when we think about literature, we think about art, I go back to C.S. Lewis's comment. We read to know we are not alone. We read to know we are not alone. And when I read analytical books, the sort of books that we're celebrating here tonight, when I read literature, when I read poetry, when I read plays, and I do read plays and poetry, funnily enough, and when I visit the theatre, when I visit art in the flesh, as it were, I know I am not alone, because the purpose of all that literature and art is to identify with the human condition. And it is the human condition in warfare and in battle that is so critical. And so the pen is mightier than the sword. Of course it is. And the spoken word, if it is spoken properly, I suspect has the edge over the pen. Thank you.